I didn't think I'd be telling this story. Even now, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, I keep thinking, how did it get this far? How did I become the person my own mother called selfish on the week of my wedding? Let me back up. My grandmother passed away in the spring 3 years ago. She had a small house in Kitchener, Ontario, nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom bungalow on a quiet street. The kind of house that smells like lavender and old books. She'd lived there for 40 years. She'd also, very quietly, saved a considerable amount of money over her lifetime. She was a school librarian. She didn't travel. She didn't spend. She just saved. And when she died, we found out she'd left her estate. The house, plus about $190,000 in a registered account, specifically to me, not to my brother, not split between us, to me. Her will was clear. Her lawyer was clear. The reason, she wrote in a letter left with the estate documents, was that she had already gifted my brother Nathan $75,000 over the years for his truck, for his business loan when his first landscaping company failed, for the down payment on his townhouse in Guelph. She felt the estate was a way of balancing things out. She loved us both equally, she wrote. But fairness wasn't always splitting down the middle. I cried reading that letter. She always saw things so clearly, my grandmother. Nathan did not take it well. He didn't say anything at the funeral. He was polite, even warm, that whole week. But about a month later, he called me. He said the will was unfair. He said grandmother must not have understood what she was doing, that she was not herself in those last months. He said I should consider signing over at least half of the estate to keep the peace. He said family didn't put money before blood. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I knew exactly what my grandmother intended. I had spent more time with her in her last years than anyone. I drove her to appointments. I brought her groceries. Not because I expected anything, I want to be clear about that. But because she was my grandmother, and she was alone, and I loved her. Nathan lived 40 minutes away and visited maybe 4 times a year. My husband. We'd been dating 3 years at that point, newly engaged. His name is Scott. Scott listened to the whole phone call from across the room, and when I hung up he just said, quietly, "You don't owe him anything." And that was that for a while. We set our wedding date in February, October 12th, the following year. We booked the venue, a beautiful old converted barn outside of Cambridge, paid the deposit, sent save the dates. We were so happy. I remember standing in our kitchen laughing because we had been going back and forth between 2 dates for weeks and finally just picked one, and it felt like the world had clicked into place. Nathan came to our engagement party in April. He gave a toast. He seemed fine. And then, in July, he called again. He and his wife, Courtney, had booked a trip. A 2-week all-inclusive in Cancun, for October 9th to October 23rd. Which meant they would miss our wedding entirely. He wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling to tell me that if I moved the date, just pushed it back, 3 weeks, he said. Just 3 weeks. They could make it work. He said he'd already talked to Mom and Dad. He said they agreed the date should move. I sat very still on the couch. Nathan, I said, you knew our date since February. I know, but we found a deal. These packages go fast. You know how it is? You booked a vacation on purpose over my wedding. I didn't do it on purpose. The dates lined up that way, and we figured you'd be flexible. I told him the date wasn't moving. He told me I was being difficult. He said I needed to consider the whole family. He said, and I remember this exactly, you've always been like this. Everything has to be your way. I hung up. 2 days later, my mother called. My mother is not a cruel woman. I want to say that clearly. She loves me, but she has spent her entire life managing Nathan's feelings, smoothing things over for him, and at 62 she is absolutely not going to stop now. She called to tell me that Nathan was devastated. She called to tell me that missing a sibling's wedding was serious and that I should think about whether the date was worth the damage to the relationship. She called to tell me that Dad agreed with her. I asked her one question. Did you tell Nathan he should change his trip? Silence. Mom. Did you call Nathan and tell him he needed to cancel the Cancun trip because he booked over his sister's wedding? She said it was complicated. It wasn't complicated. I told her I loved her and I ended the call. Scott was incredible through all of this. He was steady in a way I wasn't. I was oscillating between fury and this hollow, nauseating grief. The kind you feel when you realize the people who are supposed to be in your corner have quietly walked out of the room. Scott made me tea. I didn't ask for. He sat next to me on the couch. He said, "We are getting married on October 12th. Anyone who loves you will be there." August came. We were deep in final planning. Catering confirmations, seating charts, rehearsal dinner bookings. My maid of honor, my best friend Jess, was handling things with military precision, and I was genuinely starting to feel excited again, despite everything. Then my father emailed me. My father rarely emails. He is a phone call person. The email was 3 paragraphs long. It said that my mother and he had discussed it at length, and that if I refused to change the wedding date to accommodate my brother, they would not be attending the wedding. He said they were not choosing Nathan over me. They were choosing family unity. He said he hoped I would reconsider. He said the venue deposit was probably not worth the damage I was causing. I read the email 3 times. I forwarded it to Scott without a word. He read it, set his phone down, and said, "Okay. We need to talk to a lawyer." I thought he meant about the wedding, some practical thing. But he didn't. He meant about the estate. Here's what I didn't know, and what Scott had started to suspect. In the months since my grandmother passed, while the estate was being settled and I was navigating probate, my parents had been listed as temporary administrators of the account. This was a formality, standard when the beneficiary is managing paperwork across provinces, and it was supposed to be resolved quickly. But Scott had noticed, going through some documents, that a withdrawal had been made from the estate account. Not a small one. $38,000. The notation on the withdrawal was vague. Estate expenses. But we had already paid the estate lawyer. We had already paid the probate fees. I had the receipts. So what was $38,000 for? I called the estate lawyer, a very calm woman named Ms. Okafor, and asked her to pull the records. She called me back 2 days later. She was careful with her words. The way lawyers are when they found something they weren't expecting. She said the withdrawal had been made by my father, as administrator, and that the funds appeared to have been transferred to a joint account held by my parents. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor. I just couldn't stand up anymore. Scott came in and found me sitting there, and I told him. He sat down next to me on the floor, on the cold tile, and we just stayed there for a minute. Then he said, "We're calling Ms. Okafor back tomorrow." Ms. Okafor was very clear. The withdrawal was improper. As a state administrator, my father had a fiduciary duty to the beneficiary, me. Using estate funds for any purpose other than documented estate expenses was a breach of that duty. She said we had strong grounds to demand full restitution and, if necessary, pursue the matter through Ontario Civil Court. We sent a formal letter. Ms. Okafor drafted it. It was very polite and very firm. The $38,000 was to be returned to the estate account within 30 days, or we would file a civil claim. I didn't tell Nathan any of this. I didn't tell my mother. I just waited. My father called me 9 days later. He was angry in a way I hadn't heard from him since I was a teenager. He said Ms. Okafor had no business getting involved in family matters. He said the money had been used for expenses related to Grandma's care that he and my mother had personally covered. When I asked for documentation, he said he didn't have any. When I asked why he hadn't submitted any invoices to the estate before the account closed, he didn't have an answer for that either. The money was returned in 22 days. No documentation was ever provided for what it had supposedly covered. And my parents still did not come to my wedding. October 12th was a Saturday. Clear sky. That particular sharp October light that turns everything golden. The barn had been decorated by Jess and Scott's sister with wildflowers and warm Edison bulbs, and it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen in my life. My grandmother's sister, my great-aunt Bev, flew in from Halifax. She is 79 years old, and she has bad knees, and she booked her own flight without telling anyone, and just showed up at the rehearsal dinner with a bottle of Nova Scotia wine and said, "I wouldn't miss this for anything." I cried for about 10 minutes. My father's older brother, Uncle Pete, drove from London with his wife. He pulled me aside before the ceremony and said, "Your grandmother would have been so proud of you. She really would." He was the one who walked me down the aisle. I had been dreading that walk for months. I had pictured the space where my father would have stood, the absence of him, and I thought it might break me. But Uncle Pete offered me his arm, and he was so solid and so certain, and when we got to the end of the aisle, and Scott's face, I can't describe his face. Everything else just fell away. The ceremony was 40 minutes. We wrote our own vows. Scott cried, which he had categorically stated he would not do. Jess cried. Great-aunt Bev cried and then laughed at herself for crying. There were 2 empty seats in the front row. I noticed them. I won't pretend I didn't. But I also noticed everyone who was there. 43 people who had driven or flown from across Ontario and BC, and 1 couple from Edinburgh who were friends of Scott's parents and had planned the trip around our wedding date, which they'd had since February with no complaints, because they are normal people who understand how calendars work. At the reception, after dinner, Scott stood up. He hadn't told me he was going to do this. He told me he had a toast prepared. He's a very good public speaker, calm, funny. But what he actually did was something different. He thanked everyone who had come. He named people specifically. He thanked Great-aunt Bev by name, and she stood up and took a little bow, and everyone laughed. He thanked Uncle Pete. He said, "The people in this room showed up for us, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life showing up for every single one of you." And then he paused. And he said, "I also want to say one thing directly to my wife, in front of everyone here. You spent months being told that what you wanted didn't matter, that you were being difficult, that you should make yourself smaller to make other people comfortable. I need you to hear this. You were right. You were right the whole time, and I am so proud of you." The room was completely quiet. Then Great-aunt Bev started clapping and everyone followed, and I was absolutely not going to cry. But I did. And it wasn't a sad cry, it was something else entirely. The kind of release that only comes after a very long time of holding something in. Nathan and Courtney posted beach photos from Cancun that weekend. I saw them because we have mutual friends. Courtney was wearing a hat with a little flamingo on it. They looked like they were having a fine time. I did not post anything in response. I didn't need to. The civil matter with my parents concluded through a formal mediation process required by the estate resolution. Ms. Okafor handled it. At mediation, when the full accounting was laid out, the improper withdrawal, the lack of documentation, the timeline of events, my father's representative had very little to say. The $38,000 had already been returned. But Miss Okafor had also identified additional costs I had incurred as a result of the delay in the estate settlement, carrying costs for the property, legal fees, a tax accounting adjustment. The final amount recovered, including the returned withdrawal and additional damages, was $51,400. It is not about the money. I want to say that too and mean it this time. It was never about the money. It was about the fact that the same people who had taken from my grandmother's estate without telling me, who had helped themselves to what was mine, were simultaneously calling me selfish. That's the part that still catches in my chest when I think about it. The word they used: selfish. I moved into the Kitchener house in March with Scott. We've been renovating slowly. New flooring in the living room, a proper kitchen backsplash, fresh paint throughout. The lavender smell is mostly gone now, but sometimes, early in the morning, I think I catch it. My mother called me in January. She didn't apologize exactly. She said she missed me. She said things had gotten out of hand. She said she wished things had been different. I told her I appreciated the call. I told her I was not ready to have a larger conversation yet, but that I would let her know when I was. She said okay. She sounded older than I remembered. I haven't heard from Nathan. I have heard from Uncle Pete, who texts me periodically with updates about his garden and the occasional hockey opinion. I have heard from Great Aunt Bev, who sends handwritten cards on actual paper, which I keep in a little stack on the kitchen windowsill. Scott is building shelves in the second bedroom. We decided a few months ago that we want it to be a nursery eventually. Not yet, but eventually. We stood in the middle of that room. My grandmother's old sewing room. Still with the original light fixture she never replaced. And Scott measured the walls. And I looked out the window at the backyard, the old apple tree she loved. And I thought she knew. When she wrote that letter, when she made that choice, she knew exactly what she was doing. She was giving me a foundation. She was giving me somewhere to stand. I'm standing there now. I've thought a lot about the word selfish since all of this happened. My father used it. Nathan used it before him. My mother never said it directly, but she implied it in the way she asked me, over and over, to just consider. Just think about how this was affecting the family. And for a long time, in those months between the engagement party and the wedding, I turned that word over in my hands like something I'd found on the ground. Was I? Was I the difficult one? I don't think that anymore. But it took a while to get there. What I've come to understand is that the people who called me selfish were doing something very specific. They were taking the word and pointing it at me, so they wouldn't have to point it at themselves. Nathan had taken money, indirectly, through my father. But the outcome was the same. He had accepted $75,000 from my grandparents over the years without question, and then when the will didn't go his way, he decided the whole thing was unfair. He didn't want fairness. He wanted more. And when I wouldn't give it to him, I became the problem. That's not a family disagreement. That's just someone not getting what they wanted and needing someone to blame. I think about my grandmother a lot. She was a quiet, precise woman who thought carefully before she spoke. She didn't write that letter to cause trouble. She wrote it because she had watched her family closely for decades, and she knew exactly what was happening, and she wanted, at least once, to name it clearly. She was giving me something real. Not just the house or the money, though those things matter, practically, but the acknowledgement, the recognition that I had shown up, that I had been there, and that she had seen it. That's what Nathan couldn't stand. Not the money. The fact that she saw. Scott said something to me one night after the mediation was finished and the $51,400 had been settled, and we were sitting on the back porch of the Kitchener house, watching the last of the light go out of the apple tree. He said, "You didn't fight for the money, you fought for the truth." And he was right. I had to keep reminding myself of that when the process was exhausting and I missed my mother and I wondered if it was worth it. The answer was always the same. The truth was worth it. Not because winning felt good, though I won't pretend it didn't, but because letting it go unchallenged would have meant agreeing to a version of events that wasn't real. And I'm not willing to do that. Jess told me once that the hardest thing isn't knowing what's right, it's holding on to it when everyone around you is insisting you're wrong. She's correct. There were weeks where I genuinely doubted myself. Not about the facts, but about whether I was the kind of person who could see this through. Whether I had it in me. I did. Not because I'm exceptional in any way, because the alternative was to fold. And I folded before, smaller things, and I know exactly how it feels afterward, like you left a piece of yourself on the table and walked away without it. I'm not doing that anymore. Uncle Pete walked me down the aisle because he chose to be there. Great Aunt Bev flew from Halifax on bad knees because she chose to be there. Scott stood up in front of 43 people and said the truest thing anyone has ever said to me. None of that happened despite the circumstances. It happened because of them. The difficulty was the thing that showed me who was actually in my corner. I'm in my grandmother's house now. I'm building something real inside it. And I know, as clearly as I've ever known anything, that she would have understood exactly why.